History as it happens, June 1st, 2023. From Grozny to Bakhmut.
Russia's new leadership has intensified hostilities in Chechnya.
It's a new millennium with the same old savage war in Chechnya.
The center of Grozny is ablaze as Chechen rebels mount a desperate defense against the Russians.
Chechnya is part of the Russian Federation, and we support the territorial integrity of Russia, just as we support the territorial integrity of all its neighbors. But the violence must end.
The pictures of another Ukrainian city left in ruins by Russian shells evoke images from the Second World War. But you don't have to peer back to the 1940s to find parallels to today's war. What's happening in Ukraine happened in Chechnya twice in the 1990s under Yeltsin, then Putin. Will Ukraine meet a similar fate even if it prevails against Moscow? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Bakhmut has been fought over since last August, and Ukraine says its forces still control part of it.
But for today, Bakhmut is only in our hearts.
Let's be perfectly honest. Brute force is sadly always a military option. Particularly taking cities is an incredibly difficult and dangerous task. From the Russians' point of view, look, they didn't have the troops that they could send in whom they thought were going to be really good in urban warfare. They tried it at first and they found that often their armoured spearheads were blunted, again, as I say, by guys from the street who had got RPG rocket-propelled grenade launchers.
May 7, 2000, in the old Tsarist throne room in the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin, standing alongside a sickly Boris Yeltsin, takes the oath of office in Russia's first democratic transfer of power. Today truly is a historic day. I want to draw attention to this once more, said Putin. Really, for the first time in Russia's history, power is being transferred in the most democratic and simplest way, by the will of the people, legally and peacefully. The transfer of power, said Putin, is always a test of constitutional order, a test of its durability. This is not the first test and obviously will not be the last. But this challenge we have met, this boundary in our lives we have crossed. By the time of Putin's big day, Russia's experiment with liberal democracy and market capitalism had already been through hell. Some would say that by 2000 it was already dead. In 1993, Yeltsin had spilled blood to remain in power by ordering tanks to fire on parliament. And in 1994 to 96, Russia had used massive violence to crush Chechnyan independence. Grozny was shelled flat. If these AP archive videos of the devastated cityscape were in black and white rather than color, you might mistake mid-90s Grozny for Stalingrad in 1943. And as Putin delivered his inaugural address in 2000, promising to keep Russia a free, prosperous, strong, and civilized country, Russian forces were annihilating Grozny again in the Second Chechen War. This time a Russian victory, if you can call it that. The conflict broke out in 1999 as Yeltsin's rule was blundering to an end. His old pal across the Atlantic, President Bill Clinton, had sharply criticized the Russian assault.
Russia has set a deadline for all inhabitants now to leave Grozny or face the consequences. That means that there is a threat to the lives of the old, the infirm, the injured people, and other innocent civilians who simply cannot leave or are too scared to leave their homes. Russia will pay a heavy price for those actions, with each passing day sinking more deeply into a morass that will intensify extremism and diminish its own standing in the world.
And that led Yeltsin to bombastically respond during a trip to China when he was in really poor health. He must have for a minute, a second, a half minute forgotten what Russia is, that Russia is equipped with a full arsenal of nuclear weapons. He forgot about this, blustered Yeltsin. Clinton, don't forget what world you live in. You won't dictate to the whole world how to live. Well, that same day, Putin, then only prime minister, held a news conference where he tried to reassure everyone that the citizens of Grozny had been issued warnings to leave, to evacuate, to avoid the shelling. Russia is a great country and is not afraid of anyone or anything and will not be afraid, said Putin. I consider it absolutely incorrect that there's been a cooling of relations between Russia and the United States. Well, as we all know, the next American president tried to establish strong U.S.-Russia ties.
Russia has tended to view the expansion of freedom and democracy as a threat to its interests. The opposite is true. Free and prosperous societies on Russia's borders will advance Russia's interests by serving as sources of stability and economic opportunity. We hope Russia's leaders will recognize that a future of cooperation and peace will benefit all parties. The Cold War is over. The days of satellite states and spheres of influence are behind us.
But by the end of the next decade, things were in such bad shape again that another American president was seeking a reset.
Russia is a regional power.
Well, anyway, back to Grozny and the two Chechen wars. This history came rushing back to me when I saw pictures of Bakhmut, utterly destroyed by months of fighting between Russian and Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky acknowledged the city was no more.
But you have to understand that there is nothing. They destroyed everything. There are no buildings. It's a pity, it's tragedy, but for today, Bakhmut is only in our hearts.
The Russian bombardment reduced apartments to piles of pulverized concrete or empty shells behind a wall with all the windows blasted out. Streets piled with rubble and wrecked cars and dead bodies. Ukraine is much different than Chechnya, but there is a pattern to discuss here as we try to figure out where the war in Ukraine is headed on this podcast. Mark Galeotti is honorary professor at the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and the author of over 25 books on Russia. His latest is Putin's Wars, From Chechnya to Ukraine. He is also the director of Mayak Intelligence Consultancy. Mark Galeotti, welcome.
Good to be here.
It's an honor to have you. You are in demand these days, huh? Everyone wants to speak to you.
Alas, for all, unfortunately, the worst and most bloody of reasons.
And the reason I got in touch with you, actually, Michael Kimmage, a regular guest on the podcast, pointed me in your direction. The images coming out of Bakhmut. They drew comparisons to the Second World War, the extent of the devastation, seeing a hollowed-out cityscape. But you don't have to go back to 1940s. You can think of the mid-1990s and Grozny. Is that where your mind went?
Yeah, and indeed, even more recently, Aleppo in Syria. I mean, unfortunately, there is a certain pattern that where the Russian army goes, unfortunately, devastation tends to follow in its wake.
So there's been a lot of talk on my podcast and elsewhere about how to get a ceasefire. How are we going to end this war? And one argument out there is, well, it's been shown that Russia will never reach Kyiv, won't be able to subjugate the whole of Ukraine. And on the other side of that coin, Ukraine won't be able to expel all Russian forces from its territory either. That includes Crimea. And on top of that, the risk of nuclear escalation outweighs any benefit of imposing total defeat on the Kremlin. So it would then make sense for both sides to come to the table and stop killing each other and maybe return to the pre-February 2022 status quo. I'm just using this as one example. But, I no longer think that's a realistic scenario because of what we're seeing in Ukraine. Not just Bakhmut, but a willingness to level several major population centers. Do you follow me? And what is your thinking on that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that it's all very well talking about ceasefires, but from the Ukrainian point of view, a ceasefire just simply is an opportunity for the Russians to regroup after the hammering that they've received over the last year and a bit. But more to the point, the key thing is this. I think both sides think time is on their side. The Ukrainians think, look, they're about to launch their much-fated counteroffensive. They expect to be able to retake a certain amount of the occupied territories. And that will put them in a better position both to turn to the West and say, this is why we're the winning side, continue to support us, but also hoping that that'll put Russia into a position where it's more inclined to talk peace. Likewise, from Putin's point of view, He may not think he's going to be able to win on the battlefield, but as far as he's concerned, the potential point of weakness for Ukraine is the West. The West's willingness to continue to support Ukraine to the tune of, after all, something like $3 billion every month in financial and military assistance. And with the US elections looming next year, from his point of view, he thinks if he can hold on, if he can do so, he can outlast Ukraine's capacity to continue fighting and the West's will to continue to support it. So when both sides think ultimately time is on their side, even if you put aside the inevitable and understandable bad blood of what's happened to places like Bakhmut and even more so Mariupol and the like, putting even that to one side, they can both tell themselves that now is not the time for peace, that they'll be in a stronger position further down the line.
Yeah, I don't believe Putin is an irrational monster, but at the same time, we know what happens in wars, especially when powerful countries who don't want to lose face get involved in something that lasts a lot longer than they expected. The path of least resistance sometimes is to just try to muddle through and hope for a positive breakthrough at some point where things will finally start going your way. And I suppose from the Kremlin's perspective, they are the larger, more powerful country here, even though, of course, Ukraine is getting so much assistance from the West. But it doesn't seem to me that Putin wants the kind of peace that, we rational folks on podcasts think that warring parties should seek out after what we've seen over the past year. Russian troops have never left Moldova. They have never left Georgia. They were in the Donbass starting 9 years ago, leading to almost a decade of indecisive separatist war. I mean, this is just supposition on my part, but it seems to me that given the history we're going to discuss here, dealing with Chechnya in a moment, the Russians, and I'm not just talking about Putin himself, but Russia might be willing to level most of what it finds in Ukraine to the ground in order to secure some type of victory.
First of all, I'd want to disaggregate Putin from the Russian people. It's very, very hard, especially given the degree to which Putin's Russia has become increasingly viciously authoritarian, to really know exactly what the Russian people are thinking. But nonetheless, people have tried to do clever things with sort of opinion polling that looks at edgewise on ways of assessing how people feel about the war, because you can't go up to people and say, do you oppose the war, and expect to get an honest answer. Broadly speaking, it looks as if about a quarter of the Russian population are in favor of the war, a quarter are against, and a half are just keeping their heads down, trying not to have an opinion, and in a way just hoping that this all goes away. But it's about Putin himself and what I think he regards as politically existential for him. I think if he could freeze the conflict right now, he would regard that as a win. I mean, from his point of view, after all, he's reframed this. It's no longer about Ukraine in Putin's speeches and so forth. This is about taking on the whole of the West, the whole of NATO, which is trying to humble and control and constrain and even break up the Russian Federation. With Ukraine is just the battlefield, shall we say. So I think that's something he could spin as, look, we took territory, we're holding it against the whole of the West. The problem is, of course, that there's no way that Ukraine would or could accept that. The commitment to regaining all of the occupied territories is in the Ukrainian constitution now. It would involve an amendment to that. I also believe that however popular Zelensky is, and it's worth noting that although he kind of walks on water as far as the West is concerned, his position is not quite as robust back home in Ukraine. But I just don't know if he could survive at the moment making such a deal.
And he wasn't all that, sorry to interrupt, he wasn't all that popular prior to the outbreak of the war either.
No, I mean, but he's demonstrated himself to be an extraordinary war leader, and I think that is recognized. But certainly the nationalists, I think, almost haven't truly forgiven him for proving them wrong when they said that he was a man with no spine who wouldn't be able to cope. But the point is, exactly, I think what's going to happen, unfortunately, and it's a tragic, tragic thing, is that both sides still need to suffer a lot more before they're willing to make anything like the kind of concessions that the other side would expect. So, again, at the moment, there just isn't any grounds for that.
Andrei Kolesnikov made the same argument you just made in a recent essay in Foreign Affairs titled How Putin Revived Stalinist Anti-Americanism to Justify a Botched War. That at least publicly, yes, he's no longer talking about just Ukraine. He's talking about encirclement by the West, the EU, NATO, etc. Do you think he really believes that, or is that simply public fodder in order to justify this to his public?
I think to a large degree he does believe it, because after all, this has been a common theme of his. Look, even if one looks actually before he was president, all the way back, he was talking about how Russia is a great power. It's not a great power because of its GDP or its military might or even its nuclear weapons, but because Russia's history entitles it to that role. There's a sense that Russia has saved the world many times. It's saved the world from Napoleon and from Hitler and whatever. One doesn't have to buy that argument to believe that it's actually truly held. And look, over time, Putin's been in power directly and indirectly for 23 years. Like most autocrats who've been in power for a long time, he becomes, in effect, a caricature of himself, more and more set in his ways, more surrounded by yes men and people who just simply want to flatter his prejudices. And so, I think if one looks at probably what people are telling him, yes, they're probably telling him that the West is implacably hostile to Russia and sees this as an opportunity to basically tear Russia down. Now, I think we ought to also recognize that when it comes down to it, Putin is not an ideologue. He's not the sort of person who's willing to see everything burn in the name of an ideal. His primary goal is survival. And I think that's in some ways one of the things we have to both count on and be worried about. If Putin suddenly feels that he's in a desperate position where if he withdraws or makes a deal, he risks seeing his whole system collapse or him ousted, then he may well feel escalation is his only option. But on the other hand, if he feels that, in fact, his best choice is some kind of fairly humiliating but survivable climb down, then I think he'll take that option.
Well, I get worried when I see Russian messianism in his speeches, as we just discussed, about turning it into some type of cosmic battle between the West and Russia. I mean, that's the rhetoric on my side of the pond here. The Biden administration and public intellectuals like Ann Applebaum and Timothy Snyder. Ukraine is the front line in a war on democracy. So on both sides, that type of talk worries me. I want to return to Putin's motivations maybe near the end of our conversation. The reason why before I said I don't want to just talk about Putin, I want to talk about Russia, I did not mean to imply the Russian people are behind the war, but the state of Russia, its military, the levers of power. Because in 1994, it was not Putin who leveled Grozny, it was Boris Yeltsin. So let's start talking about Chechnya then. It's late 1994. Yeltsin orders Russian troops, we're talking about raw conscripts, right, to invade northern Chechnya. Maybe we can establish a little bit of context here. What had Chechnya's status been during the Soviet era?
It was just one more of the constituent parts of the Soviet Union, which was, in theory, a happy, mutually supportive agglomeration of peoples who wanted to build socialism together. In practice, it was in many ways the old Tsarist empire, but just given a coat of red paint. Now, the Chechens themselves, they've been conquered by the Tsarist empire in the 19th century. It's a very martial people, very much sort of focused on independence. Several times they had risen, every time they had been savagely repressed. But still, they continued to rise whenever they saw an opportunity. In World War II, Stalin had the entire Chechen people rounded up and resettled in Siberia and Kazakhstan because he feared that they might actually align with the Nazis, not because of any ideological commitment, but just as a chance to get out from under Moscow's thumb. Only after Stalin's death, the Chechens were allowed to return home. Through the Soviet period, they were always one of the various constituent nations of the Soviet Union, but one that was treated with particular caution and fear by Moscow.
So you just touched on this independence streak among Chechens. A small place, population today of about 1 million people. They declare independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And what place, and you alluded to this now, maybe we can build on a little bit. There's so much talk today about the place of Ukraine in the Russian imagination, right? Did Chechnya hold a special place among Russian nationalists?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. I've sometimes wondered whether or not we could actually describe Russians as victims of their own literature. Because if you look at 19th century representations of the Chechens, they were always presented as, in some ways, the noble bandit, but the absolutely implacable one. They were the sort of the bugbear, and the view was, look, if a Chechen swears a blood oath, then that Chechen will do whatever it takes to accomplish that. There is this sense that they are that much more formidable And look, there's a fair amount of truth in that. I mean, as someone who did his doctorate on the Soviet war in Afghanistan and then has later looked a lot at the Chechen fighters, I've got to be honest that actually I would rather take on Afghans than Chechens, which gives you some sense of just how martial a nation they are. And still to this day, even though I think it's become increasingly less real, but nonetheless, I encounter, well, back when unfortunately last year, I was banned indefinitely from Russia. But when I was still traveling there, I would encounter Russian officials, security officers, military people, and so forth, who still had this sense that the Chechens were somehow 10 foot tall. And absolutely still the kind of the old notion of blood oath swearing fighters to the end.
Putin has discussed Ukrainians as a brother people. Do Russians talk about Chechens in the same way? I mean, it doesn't sound like it.
Absolutely not. Quite the opposite. They're the people you need to be afraid of. They are the bugbears. And, if one looks at, for example, Chechen organized crime has a disproportionate role still within the Russian underworld. But the fascinating thing was actually, although the Chechens have a formidable reputation for violence, I once did some analysis, and Chechen gangs would actually be much less often involved in gang wars. And the very reason for that was precisely that no one wanted to take them on. Oh. That even within Russian organized crime, not exactly a bunch of shrinking violets, they would think, whoa, but when it comes to the Chechens, best to make a deal.
So the first Chechen War starts, as I mentioned, late 1994. In 1993 is when Yeltsin turns the cannons or the tanks on the Russian White House, which was the parliament. And some have said that was it for the Russian experiment in liberal democracy. And then the next year, another nail driven into that coffin of Russian liberal democracy with this first war in Chechnya. What motivates, given what we're discussing here, what motivates Yeltsin to send in the troops to keep this part of the Russian Federation from becoming independent? Geopolitics, material interests, concerns about security, Russian chauvinism?
I mean, a little bit of many of those. Look, what had happened is essentially when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991 and the Russian Federation emerged as its successor over much of its territory, Boris Yeltsin at the time, who was, after all, by instinct and by history, he was a local strongman party boss. He came from the Communist Party. He was not a natural Democrat. But still, this was his platform. And he spoke to the various Russian regions and he said, take as much independence as you can swallow. And most regions regarded that as essentially rhetorical. The Chechens thought, well, great, thanks very much indeed. We've long wanted to be free. That's what we're going to do. And so, although technically the Russian Federation regarded itself as still in control of Chechnya, the Chechens thought that they declared independence. And what happened is, actually over the next few years, we see a sort of a tug of war between central institutions and the Chechen ones. And by 93, 94, two things are clear. One is that the Chechens are not going to play ball and accept to return into the Russian Federation willingly. But secondly, that Chechnya itself, because it's this small, almost a bandit kingdom, is becoming a hub for all kinds of criminality and insurgency. And I think from Yeltsin's point of view, first of all, after shelling his own parliament, which technically speaking, he was no longer president after that point, even though he then retrospectively rewrote the constitution to say it was okay. But anyway, Yeltsin could not afford to appear to look weak, especially because by that point his problems with drink and drugs were becoming increasingly evident. Secondly, there was this major fear that if Chechnya broke free, other regions might. Chechnya didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But if it led to a sort of a rolling process, you might have big regions like Tatarstan, which most importantly has oil, say, well, actually, we'll take the same route. So there was a fear that it would become an example. And the final element is precisely that a lot of people around Boris Yeltsin did very well out of the Chechen War, and therefore were happy to encourage him to move in because they knew that there would be fortunes to be made.
The breakup of an empire or internal disintegration, right, is a messy, messy process. I often think of the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union as mostly bloodless. Well, that was certainly the case in 89, 90, 91, but not by the mid-1990s. So talking motivations here, I think it's critical, don't you, to understand this, because there's so much debate today about what's motivating Russia to invade Ukraine, keep it from joining the West. Why is there this special relationship historically between Russia and Ukraine that is different than, say, Russia, Finland, Russia, Poland, right? So I think it's important to understand the Russia-Chechnya relationship in this context. And here's one parallel that may work. Not all the parallels work, but Russian soldiers are sent marching single file into Chechnya. They think they're going to have an easy time of it. This is December 1994. What happens?
Yeah, I mean, it's an absolute debacle. I mean, the Russian forces, look, in the 1990s, the Russian military was in a catastrophic state. It had been suffering not just diminished assets, but a total collapse of the chain of command and of morale. No one really knew what the former Red Army was for. And you had soldiers who had been relocated back from East Germany who had nowhere to live. They were living in unheated tank sheds. You had soldiers who weren't being paid their salaries and therefore, not surprisingly, were sort of moonlighting as mafia hitmen, all of these problems. And then you take that military and you throw it into Chechnya without any real planning or logistical backup. Again, pretty obvious parallel with what happens in Ukraine. Without any real sense of why they're there. Again, much like Ukraine, because from their point of view, frankly, if the Chechens want to leave, why don't you just let them?
Exactly.
But also up against, and again, yet another parallel, are people who are massively motivated. They know why they're fighting. They want to fight. They're united by kinship bonds amongst their clans. They have a long legacy of reasons to hate the Russians. And now, at last, they have a chance to play that out.
Well, it was just a few thousand fighters were able to humiliate this great, large army.
Yeah, I mean, look, on one level, I mean, to give a parallel, it's almost a little bit like the rest of the United States could not defeat Delaware.
Yeah.
So, and that becomes...
Or
first
South
of all,
Vietnam.
But also, it only adds to the mystique of the indomitable Chechens. And look, on one level, it's true. You know, you've got Chechens taking out the latest Russian tanks with basically a Kalashnikov, a can of paint, and a grenade. You spray the tank with a Kalashnikov so that the commander closes his hatch. You spray paint all over the vision blocks so they can't see where they're going or what. And when the driver has to open his hatch just in order to see where he's going, you drop a hand grenade in. You know, that's your classic low-tech versus high-tech, and the low-tech wins. And all of this makes people even more scared of the Chechens.
I mentioned Vietnam. I think it was, I might be wrong about this, Lyndon Johnson who called it a peasant or a pissant country or something. And how could the sophisticated, militarily advanced United States lose to a peasant army? But not to digress about Vietnam, but I think in the post-colonial era, we see this repeated over and over and over again. So the initial Russian foray fails, and then the response from Moscow is to follow up with brute force. And Grozny is destroyed, right?
Yeah, it is absolutely leveled. And look, let's be perfectly honest, brute force is sadly always a military option. Particularly taking cities is an incredibly difficult and dangerous task. It's one that even the most modern and advanced armies do not take on lightly. If one looks at the kind of the shaping operations that were carried out, for example, before forces went into the cities in Iraq, you know, there was that sense that you have to try and make sure that everything, the circumstances are as ideal as possible because you know you're still going to be vulnerable. From the Russians' point of view, look, they didn't have the troops that they could send in whom they thought were going to be really good in urban warfare. They tried it at first and they found that often their armored spearheads were blunted, again, as I say, by guys from the street who had got RPG rocket-propelled grenade launchers. So much easier just to stand back and bomb and shell and pound a city into rubble and then place your flag atop that pile of rubble and call it a victory.
You just wrote an article, I believe it was in The Spectator, where you said that the Russians today in Ukraine are firing 10,000 artillery shells per day.
Exactly. Artillery's always been the Russian god of war. And certainly in Chechnya, that's what they fell back on.
So is this then the Russian way of war, going all the way back to, say, World War II? And maybe this is unfair or it's stereotype. It's use your own infantry as cannon fodder and then just level population centers to the ground with thousands upon thousands of shells. And if you kill everyone who lives there, oh well.
There's always the danger in making it too cartoonish. And in particular, I mean, actually, until relatively recently, we had seen the Russians much less willing to use their own infantry as cannon fodder. In some ways, you use your artillery precisely in order to save your infantry. If someone's going to die, you'd rather it be an enemy civilian than one of your own soldiers. But absolutely, there's pragmatic ruthlessness that says that, look, war is an inherently barbaric act, and therefore it's silly to be thinking too much about little sort of shades of barbarism. If you're going to do it, you do it properly. And unfortunately, that definitely has been a Russian way of war, and especially their reliance on artillery, which is, in these circumstances, a pretty undiscriminating instrument.
In a sense, it makes no sense. If Russia is going to into Ukraine to save it, right? That's the public rationale, save it from Nazis or whoever, or keep it from joining the West, keep it in Russia's orbit, then why destroy the whole place? Well, that is the point, apparently, to subjugate it.
Well, when it didn't work, see, the interesting thing is, look, the standard way in which the Russians plan and train for major offensive operations, they would begin with what they call a morale, which is a massed rocket airborne strike, which would have been precisely the sort of a huge blow all across the country, in which you basically aim to try and blow up every barracks, crater every runway. The interesting thing is that when they went into Ukraine, there was a certain preliminary bombardment, but nothing like the scale that in some ways Russian military doctrine would have required. And that's in part precisely because Putin, and remember how far Putin has disastrously micromanaged this war, was so certain that the Ukrainians were not really going to fight, so certain that the country was going to just fall into his hand within a matter of days. Why blow up that which you are soon going to control? It was only actually when the Ukrainians demonstrated that they weren't willing to go along with Putin's plan, that they were willing to fight and fight with extraordinary determination. It's only then that, as it were, the Russians fell back into this. But it said, in this respect, just as in Chechnya, it was really a mark of desperation rather than actual planning. If you are finding yourself now with cities that are resisting and you can't take them by speed, which is what was the original plan, well, all you've got left is firepower.
Thank you for pointing that out. This is not the war they expected to be fighting. They did believe their troops would be strutting into Kyiv within weeks, and to borrow Dick Cheney's infamous remark from the 2003 Iraq War, welcomed as liberators. So the First Chechen War ends in 1996. It's considered a Russian defeat. And Russia, of course, is in the throes of a lot of internal tumult at this point. What was public opinion? Is it possible to know generally what ordinary Russians thought of this debacle as it came to an end, the first war in 1996?
I mean, they were horrified by it. I mean, we've got to remember that once the Russians had taken Grozny, the capital city, there was a sense of, well, now we move on. And the Chechens took it back. I mean, again, what a humiliation that a kind of a ragtag, more a militia than anything else, has managed to push out the Russian army from a city. It's one thing to not take a city, but to actually lose it. So I think from the Russians' point of view, it was interesting because on the one hand, there was deep humiliation, a sense precisely that the Russians had been humbled. There was also horror at the casualties, in fairness to on both sides, Chechen civilians as well as Russians, although there was much less awareness of the civilian casualties. But, a sense that this had been such a bloody waste of human lives, Russian lives. And thirdly, and this is what really kind of paves the way to the Second War, a sense that this was not the end of things, that there hadn't been a proper resolution, that the Chechens are neither now happy members of the Russian Federation, nor are they independent. And I think the thing that struck me when I was there and talking to people was that sense that this is not really the peace. This is just the interlude.
So a Chechen military commander does win an election, Aslan Moskadov, and I know you will correct my lousy pronunciation if necessary. He wins an election, but as you say, Chechnya never really establishes itself as an independent sovereign state. After all, it had been destroyed. We've already established it's not a very big place. Grozny, a major population center, totally leveled. And it slips back into chaos. And the Russians never really quite gave up on, well, the first war.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and yes, I have to correct you, Moskadov was a truly brilliant guerrilla commander. I mean, really one of the greats of the last 100 years. But on the other hand, it's always much harder to be a nation builder if you had been a military commander. And the fact of the matter is it was incredibly hard for him. He was trying to build a kind of a working, essentially secular state. Increasingly, he'd find himself pressed by, rival clans and factions, but also actually by a rising tide of jihadism. Increasingly, the Islamic sort of fundamentalist element of the Chechen population, who had performed quite strongly within the war, were more and more assertive and more actually forcing Maskhadov to adopt a more Islamist line, but anyway, not really trusting him because they knew he wasn't one of them. And so actually what happens is in these 3 years, the country increasingly slides into chaos and Maskhadov just simply can't control it. He tries to hold the line, but he's just not able to build a working Chechen state.
So in 1999, this is a decade into Russia's so-called experiment with market capitalism and democracy. Things are not going well at all. Yeltsin is faltering badly. He has a split with Clinton over the renewed violence in Chechnya, which is causing a refugee problem.
All I can tell you is that we will continue to press for a minimization of civilian casualties and a maximum use of negotiated options to settle this. I think that in the end there will have to be a political solution, and I hope that the end will come sooner rather than later, so fewer people will die.
And he appoints Vladimir Putin to be his acting prime minister, some title like that. And there are a series of apartment bombings in Russia that Putin blames on Chechen terrorists. Have we ever figured out who is actually responsible for these bombings?
I mean, do we actually have the kind of proof that can stand up in a court of law? No. No great surprise. But on the other hand, there is a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest it was carried out by the security forces themselves. Whether Putin knew about this or orchestrated it, or whether it was just, as it were, a favor to one of their own, because it obviously allowed him to then play the sort of nationalist and anti-terrorist global war on terror, one could almost call, card. But almost certainly it came from within the state apparatus.
And Putin is the person, more so than Yeltsin, who prosecutes the second war in Chechnya. Putin is elected president in 2000 when Grozny is destroyed again. This is about reestablishing Russian state power against a breakaway region.
He often uses wars as examples. I mean, the same way as later on he'd use a war with Georgia, not so much just for about Georgia, but to show all the various post-Soviet states, bear in mind you're in the Russian sphere of influence. But yes, so this was about bringing Chechnya back into the fold by force so that everyone realized you do not break away from the Russian Federation. But it was also about the making of Putin. Putin had a very rapid rise, but he was still pretty unknown. And this was going to be how he was going to establish his persona with the Russian people. I mean, in part, it was about proving that he was not Yeltsin, that he was relatively young and dynamic and active, proving that he could fix something that Yeltsin had left unfixed, but also proving that Russia is in a dangerous situation and it needs a tough advocate of its interests. Just like one Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
So major combat in the Second Chechen War ends by the middle of 2000, and this is considered a Russian victory. To this day, Russia still dominates Chechnya. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, it turns out in hindsight to be quite a kind of Pyrrhic victory. Look, I mean, they win in the sense of absolutely. They destroy any kind of organized resistance to a large extent precisely by bringing Chechens in on their side, so they kind of Chechenize the conflict. And it is now, say, part of the Russian Federation. However, the price that they have to pay is they basically hand over control of Chechnya to the Kadyrov family, who are sort of a particular sort of powerful clan who end up supporting them. And now it's currently Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the sort of the warlord of Chechnya, really. Chechnya is still almost entirely dependent on money from Moscow, from the federal center. Kadyrov rules Chechnya as if it's his own personal fiefdom. I mean, he even actually pushes out the Russian security apparatus from acting within Chechnya, and he gets the Russians to pay for it. The irony is, although Chechnya is these days a despotic, semi-Islamized, in effect, independent satrapy, but nonetheless, because officially it's a loyal part of the Russian Federation, Moscow counts that as a win.
And Chechnyan militias are fighting in Ukraine today. I think it's important to understand what the end game here was, because we're trying to figure out, what does Putin envision as the end game in Ukraine? Does he want to establish something similar to what was established in Chechnya? I mentioned at the top of the interview, Russian forces have never left Moldova. They've never left Georgia. In a sense, it's forever war or forever domination under Moscow. I don't know.
Look, I think
that
absolutely.
Makes
look,
any sense.
From Putin's point of view, Ukraine is still not a real country. The Ukrainians are not a real people. They are a sort of annex of Russia. They're part of Moscow's historical, cultural patrimony. And that, absolutely informs his assumptions about Ukraine. Historically illiterate, but nonetheless kind of very politically powerful for him. Now, his initial plans, I think we have to realize the degree to which his plans morph over time, also depending on the circumstances. His initial plan was clearly not to incorporate Ukraine within the Russian Federation, but simply to impose a puppet regime, which would realize that its place was precisely within Russia's sphere of influence.
No EU,
so in some ways,
no NATO.
Yeah, exactly. And so in some ways, I think, his goal was in some ways equivalent to what we saw in Chechnya, that he doesn't need to run every aspect of day-to-day administration, as long as the leader genuflects symbolically towards Moscow, provides troops when needed, or whatever else. But the point is, look, those days have clearly gone. Would Putin like to have all of Ukraine under his control? Sure, he would. But the point is, I think he's also fully aware that that's not going to happen. Yeah. So now, he's just desperately looking for something that he can call a triumph. Part and parcel of that, from his point of view, at least here and now, includes Chechnya. Sorry, Crimea. This is a sort of Freudian slip. Having Crimea sort of recognized as part of Russia. But the thing is, look, just as his goals have already shifted, they may well shift further on in the war. And that's what the Ukrainians are counting on.
Wars are unpredictable, and maybe the key parallel in all of this is the willingness to use massive amounts of violence to get his way in Chechnya and now in Ukraine. So in the final analysis here, I'd like to ask you a question that I've posed to so many of the other scholars who have been on my program. What is Putin's worldview? He's been called a fascist. I do not call him that. A Marxist-Leninist, a Russian statist. He's been accused of wanting to commit genocide in Ukraine or to colonize Ukraine. He wants to restore the Soviet Union. No, he wants to restore Greater Russia. He's a czar. He's a, whatever. He's acting defensively out of fear of encirclement by the West and NATO, and that is, of course, a historic Russian fear. But not all of these things can be true simultaneously. What is Mark Galeotti's take on Putin, his worldview, and his motivations? Motivations being different than aims.
Sure. Well, look, I think, to be honest, I think that Putin has changed over time. In some ways, I think one would regard him in his early years as what we could think of as a liberal nationalist. He was actually quite socially liberal, politically liberal, but on the other hand, he believed in a strong Russia. Over time, clearly he has changed. A lot of what he advocates, frankly, is quite fascist. But I would say the trouble is when we say fascist, people tend to conflate that with Nazi. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's much more the Mussolini model of fascism, which is very much a sort of strong statism that squeezes out any political functions that are not part of the state. I don't believe that he's interested in the genocide of the Ukrainian people. This is a horrible, horrible war, but genocide implies intent. I don't think he wants to wipe out the Ukrainian people.
It's bad enough without having to use that term.
In his own mind, I believe he really does think that he's acting defensively, that he does feel that Russia is assailed, that the West is trying to deny Russia its proper place in the world. But of course, his is a very, shall we say, offensive defensiveness. Because remember, one of the things that he writes in his ghost-written memoirs, he talks about one of the lessons he learned as a sort of scrappy kid growing up in the quite violent streets of post-war, what was then still Leningrad, St. Petersburg today, was that if you're going to get into a fight, you throw the first punch. And although it's a little bit facile to move from sort of childhood lessons to the present day, but I think there is still a lot of that he thinks of himself as fighting back. The trouble is, though, that he's now so lost, I think, within his sense of his historic destiny, his legacy building and so forth, that it's very hard for him to step back and try and look objectively at the situation. I think ultimately, though, he's a 19th century geopolitician. He's a nationalist who believes in an era of spheres of influence, of great powers that get to dictate and break over the sovereignty of others. And he thinks that if you are not a great power, you are by definition a subordinate power. And therefore, in a way, he's pushing to ensure that Russia is recognized as a great power. I think a Bismarck or a Napoleon would be able to understand Putin really rather well.
On the fascism note, the reason I don't call him a fascist or believe that Russia is a fascist state is based on my own definition that I use, happens to be Roger Griffin's definition. I also apply what I've learned from reading Ian Kershaw, Richard Evans on the Third Reich, and that is, at its mythic core, fascism has rebirth, or palingenesis, as Roger Griffin likes to say, and I don't see that here with Putin. And you said he started off as somewhat of a liberal nationalist. Was there a change in him circa 2003, the Iraq War, trying to convince George W. Bush this is not a unipolar world where you can do what you want? And then in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, he makes it clear where he stands. I mean, is that a hinge point here?
A transition. I mean, absolutely. Look, when Putin first comes to power, he realizes that Russia's interests and the West's are different. But nonetheless, I think he genuinely believes that it's possible to reach a modus vivendi whereby, everyone can be happy. I mean, there's even talk, and I don't think that's serious, but nonetheless revealing that even he talks about whether Russia should join NATO. Now, again, he expects Russia to be fast-tracked and be given a privileged access. But nonetheless, the very fact he's talking about it. But the trouble is then he had, I think, very unrealistic expectations of what that relationship meant. For example, he felt, look, we will wholeheartedly support America's global war on terror. You want to use Russian airspace to resupply your forces in Afghanistan or anything else like that, no problem. His view was that he could then consider to be Chechnya to be his front in that global war. And therefore he seems genuinely to be angered and feel betrayed when people started to make criticisms about the extraordinary human rights abuses that were being carried out in Chechnya. He almost felt that was a kind of a breaking of the deal. Iraq, absolutely, from his point of view, it's, hey, why were we not consulted? A great power gets to be consulted in all such issues. So by the time we get to the Munich speech, that's absolutely, it's a sort of a statement of him realizing, nope, we tried to play nice, and as far as we're concerned, you're taking us for a ride. But the point is, he's building on really a decade through the 1990s of Russian dissolution. You mentioned when in 1993, Boris Yeltsin shells his own parliament. Yes, a nasty parliament elected in Soviet times, full of all kinds of communists and nationalists. But still, constitutionally, he was no longer president. We in the West, we didn't like that parliament either. So when he rewrote the constitution, we just simply said, fine, that's great. In 1996, it looked like Yeltsin was going to lose an election to the communists. And frankly, then the election was therefore rigged to keep him in power. We didn't want the communists to win, so we hailed Yeltsin's re-election.
Clinton was a big backer of Yeltsin.
Absolutely. But we can't be then surprised that the Russians think that we're sanctimonious hypocrites.
Oh.
And that democracy is always a sort of a managed thing. So anyway, Putin was building on that. And look, I mean, yes, he then acquired increasingly sort of one could almost describe paranoid assumptions. For me, one of the key turning points, well, there's two. One is Libya, when as far as he's concerned, Russian approval for a United Nations mandate for using air power to support civilians gets used as an opportunity to basically go after Gaddafi. And as far as he's concerned, then basically that was just a shell game. But then when he comes back to power, again, obviously after a rigged election, 2011, 2012, we have the so-called Bolotnaya protests, mass protests in Moscow, a middle-class, metropolitan, cosmopolitans who basically, were angry at having their vote taken in vain. And from Putin's point of view, that's a sign that the West is coming for him. He couldn't believe that this was a genuine, organic Russian protest against him. He assumed it had to be a nefarious CIA and, God bless him, also MI6. I mean, the Russians still regard Britain as being their most subtle and devious antagonist, and it's lovely to still feel relevant.
Well, Mark Galeotti, your insights are more than relevant. They're critical. We thank you for being here, and for anyone who is new to this subject, Mark wrote a book that I think is a great introduction, A Short History of Russia, published in 2020. On the next episode of History as It Happens, it'll be June 6, so you know what's coming.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
D-Day and its brutal aftermath. we're going to try to separate memory from history and confront the true horrors of war with Cathal Nolan as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.